I think that's the psychological story of Job. That's the psychological story of the flesh becoming the word. Hey guys, Lucas Garvey here, and today I have another Carl Jung book discussion. This week it's Answer to Job. And pretty much in this book, he's going to go through and dissect and discuss the story of Job, which is really one of the most hard-hitting and brutal stories in the entire Old Testament. Really tough book to get your hands around because it doesn't really equal the sort of typical loving God that we hear about so much, and merciful God. You know, in the book of Job, God is really a very brutal dude, you could say. So in this book, Carl Jung, he just discusses and says what it means psychologically and what it could be about and all that stuff. So we're just going to jump in and discuss. And I think before jumping into specifics, there's a couple key ideas that Jung claims. And I think if I just say those claims forthrightly, and then we can circle back and explain where he's coming from, it'll make this a lot more understandable. So one of the chief things that Jung tries to elaborate on is the idea that God, especially in the Old Testament, is an unconscious God, which might sound confusing because God is supposed to have, in the narrative, he's supposed to be an omniscient figure. He knows everything. He's everywhere at the same time, those kind of things. But Jung claims that similar to how a human being, conscious can nag at us, we can be maybe consciously aware of something and choose to ignore it a lot of the time, that God in the Old Testament stories acts in a very similar way, but with his omniscience, where he fails to console the omniscience that he possesses. So that's one of the big overarching themes of this entire book, that God is really unconscious. And not only that, he's especially unconscious compared to the figure of Job. And in the story of Job, it's so crazy. And he kind of, I don't want to say he treats it like it's a precursor of Christ, but it's a similar, it's almost like the flip, right? Because in the story of Job, Jung claims that it was the first time ever where a human figure morally ascended past the stars in heaven and was more morally righteous than God himself. And it's almost like the reverse of the Christ narrative, where in the story of Christ, right, God comes down as a man and he becomes a man. So it's almost the heightened morality, the word becomes flesh kind of a thing, comes down into the mortal plane of existence. Whereas in the story of Job, his heightened morality that allows him to ascend past God itself, it's almost as if the story of Job is a story of the flesh becoming the word. It's almost the reverse of the typical Christ narrative, which is also very interesting. So that's number two. That's like the second big kind of overarching idea that Jung kind of talks about in the book. And then finally, the third big idea that Jung talks about, and this isn't everything, but these are kind of the three that are coming to mind in the present moment. Carl Jung, he claims that, first, he claims that the story of Job connects directly with the story of Christ, that in a sense, the story of Christ is almost God trying to rectify and reconcile what he did to Job. Like he just failed so completely as an honorable God in that case. He was so easily deceived by Satan, right? And because of that, God's failure in Job leads directly to him trying to reconcile himself in the story of Christ, which Jung also talks about. This is also, it's kind of crazy and batshit because, why does God even have to send down Christ in the first place? Can he just purify all of man? Like that wasn't an option in his mind, right? In his sort of hungry God mind, he had to send his son and murder him brutally to offer forgiveness. So it's kind of it represents sort of the archaic side of the Father God, but that's besides the point. So those are the three major things that I feel like Jung tries to talk about in this book. God is unconscious, especially in the Old Testament. Job ascends beyond the figure of God himself, and it's the story of it's the flesh becoming the word. It's a human moral figure who's able to morally supersede God himself, which is Jung kind of claims is kind of a prelude to the Christian narrative, which is interesting. So third, God wants to become a man, which that's a really interesting way of phrasing it, because from my perspective, not even my perspective, I would say almost the typical Judeo-Christian perspective, or I guess just Christian perspective, was that God had to lower himself into flesh to, grace himself upon the earth. Whereas Jung says that that's not really the whole case, that God willingly wanted to become a man, that there was something about mankind that he didn't possess as a god, so he wanted to come down as a man and become a man. If you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate if you could go down and leave a like and a comment if you want down below. But personally, whenever I see a like or a comment, it's just really awesome and really motivates me to make more videos, and I really appreciate it when you guys leave a like or a comment to these videos. So yeah, if you're liking it, please leave a like. Also, if you're really liking it, maybe hit that subscribe button. Allegedly, maybe hit a bell or two, possibly. So those are three big things that I think, those are kind of the three ideas that are good to keep in mind as we go through the book. So this little section here, actually, I feel delves into the concept of God being an unconscious being, and Jung really briefly and very eloquently explains his positioning and why he thinks that. And for the most part, he's really just saying that a conscious God wouldn't allow evil deeds, ultimately. That's kind of the large gist of his argument. Like, if God is supposed to be this all-knowing, loving thing, then why would there be so much misery in the world? Jung argues that he's an unconscious force, and he is omniscient, but he doesn't console it, and that's why he acts out in crazy rages. And you even see that like in the Old Testament stories, where instead of God saying, "Oh, I'm not going to hit you guys, so you're fine," he's like, "All right, I'm going to hide you from my wrath." So God doesn't even have the self-control to destroy and not destroy the people he wishes. He just, when he goes and enters his wrath, so to speak, he just destroys everything. So on the idea that God is unconscious as conscious, Jung says, the naive assumption that the creator of the world is a conscious being must be regarded as a disastrous prejudice which later gave rise to the most incredible dislocations of logic. For example, the nonsensical doctrine of the privatio boni would never have been necessary had one had to assume in advance that it is impossible for the consciousness of a good God to produce evil deeds. Divine unconsciousness and lack of reflection, on the other hand, enable us to form a conception of God which puts his actions beyond moral judgment and allows no conflict to arise between goodness and beastliness. So even there, Jung almost compares God to a beast, right? Well, you can't really morally judge a bear for killing an animal the same way that you can morally judge a human being. So that's kind of what Jung is getting at, that God's unconscious is closer to beasts and animals than he is to the human being, right? The human being has a moral integrity that they have to live up to, whereas a bear, they don't care. And God's closer to being a bear than a human being. So the allegory being represented here is God acting out as unconscious contents that are attempting to spring up and become conscious. That's kind of what Jung is saying about the entire Old and New Testament narrative, that in the Old Testament, God's unconscious, and he's trying to become conscious. And when Jung says he's trying to become a man, that's kind of what he's really meaning. God's trying to become conscious. He's trying to become self-aware and become reflectionary, that he can look back on, God can see himself, kind of a thing. He doesn't want to just be a force of nature that is completely uncontrollable and disastrous. He wants to become a man that can have a moral value and have an ability to self-reflect and be conscious of oneself. So that's kind of what Jung's saying, and that's representative of the unconscious becoming conscious. And Jung actually makes a really interesting comment later in the book. I can't remember exactly what it is, but he says something along the lines that an unconscious content kind of lives in a very bizarre pseudo state, or it's torn back and forth, so to say, where the unconscious content wants to be conscious while at the same time wanting to stay unconscious. You can really see this when you're kind of doing something new, or that's something outside your comfort zone that you might have a lot of anxiety or insecurity or be afraid about. You can really feel that sense of, you're unconscious wanting to take that step and do that new exciting thing. But then at the same time, your unconscious is also pulling in the opposite direction, where it wants to stay hidden and be in the shadow. So that's kind of what Jung's saying about how unconscious contents can be kind of pulled back and forth, where they want to be made conscious, but they also want to stay in the back. That's kind of the gist of what he's getting at. And it's really interesting, too, because I think that's exactly right, because fear and excitement, which you could say that fear is maybe how we experience the unconscious, want to remain suppressed, and excitement being that feeling of, there's something new, like almost an enlightenment kind of a thing, where the unconscious is springing up and I'm being told new information. I know something new now. Personally, I feel those two feelings of fear and excitement are so close. Like, they are so close on the emotional spectrum, where you can just jump over, I think. Like, if you can just dial in, you can really be afraid of something and then turn that into excitement. Or if you're excited about something, that can become fear if you start overthinking it, you know? So it's a very interesting idea, and I really think it's right. I love the idea. I like the psychological idea that Jung is trying to convey. So that's that. So this next section is pretty interesting. Here, Jung kind of talks about the progression of God from the Old Testament, back at creation, all the way through the New Testament, and what kind of the progress of God becoming a more specific entity, right? And it's kind of how God starts off as the representation of all reality and is centralized into the figure of man. One should make clear to oneself what it means when God becomes man. It means nothing less than a world-shaking transformation of God. It means more or less what creation meant in the beginning, namely an objectification of God. At the time of the creation, he revealed himself in nature. Now, he wants to be more specific and become man. So what Jung is getting at here is that the event of God becoming a man is just as profound as God going from nothingness to everything, right? It's a similarly dramatic jump. It's about dialing in the specificity of God himself. In the Old Testament, he was nature. In the New Testament, he's man. But I think in this instance and in this paragraph, Jung is trying to argue that by God becoming more specific, the aim of the high good is more specific, and mankind has a higher and more specific ideal, you could say. Whereas in the Old Testament, they were just making the rules. You go from having the 10 Commandments to one man, right? You go from kind of a huge hogposh of rules and things trying to ascertain and figure out, and it gets coalesced and centered into one figure of Christ. And that's it's the coalescing and the distilling of everything into one figure. And I think that's what Jung is trying to get at. It's that process of God becoming that one coalesced figure. So what does all of this have to do with the story of Job? It took the story of Job for God to want to become man. Before that, I don't think God cared at all. He was a pretty wild dude, and he was wild out and did whatever he wanted. And I think it took for the figure of Job to ascend beyond him for him to kind of rethink it. And he couldn't hide away from it anymore. He couldn't hide from the unconscious conscience couldn't be hid anymore. He had to acknowledge and accept that man was more moral and more righteous than him. Jung kind of sums up at the end of this chapter. He says, to sum up, the immediate cause of the incarnation lies in Job's elevation, and its purpose is the differentiation of Yahweh's consciousness. For this, a situation of extreme gravity was needed, a perpetua charged with effect, without which no higher level of consciousness can be reached. So, the story of Job was necessary, and for Job to ascend beyond God for the Christian narrative to play out the way it did. So what does that mean psychologically? The unconscious obliterates a moral figure due to insecurities, right? Because Satan kind of tricks and plays God by playing on his insecurities. That's why God does it in the first place. So an insecure, unconscious object obliterates a moral man, and the moral man or moral figure is resilient and maintains a moral composure and ascends beyond the omniscient unconscious object. If you strip all the numeral elements of the story, that's the bones of it. That's the bare bones story. So psychologically, what I think that means, the unconscious force tries to obliterate the human being, but the human being survives and ascends beyond the unconscious aspect completely, morally, in every aspect. It's almost saying that at any time, a man can be possessed by an unconscious force, right? Now that could be, you can get swatted up into sort of the momentum of the world, which is outside of your control and kind of acts unconsciously in a lot of ways. But that can also be an internal thing. So at any time, an unconscious force can completely envelop and take over an individual or a human being. And this could happen at gigantic, large scales with, giant warfares or political movements, whatever the case may be, where these things are so beyond the individual's control that they're pretty much unconscious forces or not purposeful forces in the figure's life. But these can also be internal, where, whether it's insecurities or fears or literally anything, unconscious elements that are just trying to take over the entire human being. And like an unconscious spirit, you could say, that has a fear in your soul, or even a desire, it will do everything in its power, I think, to get what it wants or to avoid what it fears. It will just completely scrape and destroy everything in your life to avoid that thing. Now, you can see that in alcoholism. It'll destroy everything to get the thing that it wants. This could be seen in fears of rejection. Like, it'll do everything to avoid the possibility of being rejected, and so it won't take any chances doing anything. So that's the kind of a thing. So that's the unconscious side. But the figure of Job, he is a figure who survives the unconscious onslaught, which is an unbelievably rare thing. It's brutally rare, unfortunately, that the human being can take on the brunt of an unconscious dilemma and have their lives destroyed in the process, and not have them, still have integrity and still have character and still be locked in, so to say, and still be in their flesh, so to speak. And doing so, they transcend beyond the unconscious. And not only that, by doing that, I think the unconscious contents would become conscious and actualized, because only one can survive at the end of the day. It's either the unconscious content is going to take over your life and you're going to be a drug addict or whatever the case may be, or you're going to survive and you're going to unearth that unconscious content and lift it up and say, let's make this dude conscious, right? That seems maybe a bit more obvious on the internal side, where it's like, it's going to be one side of me or the other. We can't have both. But I think that's even true on a, countrywide, statewide scale. If enough figures, or even one figure, one person, really in some cases, if they can survive the onslaught and the brunt force of the unconscious forces destroying them and still remain their character, then they instantly ascend beyond the entire political problem, you could say, as an example, or whatever the case may be, and they act as a symbol, I guess you could say, to put it so clichély or terribly. So I think it's true on both spheres, whether the unconscious force is internal or on the outside. If you can survive the onslaught, if you can just out-survive it and remain your character, no matter what, the unconscious conscious will have to be made conscious, whether it's made conscious within you or that's made unconscious on a collective unconscious level, on a state level. I think those are the ultimate options. I think that's the psychological story of Job. That's the psychological story of the flesh becoming the word. So we've been talking a lot about how God is a savage monkey man who's just completely unconscious. And even Jung kind of starts talking about this halfway through the book. But pretty much, that's not the full story. The typical stuff, the loving God, the merciful God, that stuff's real and that's true. But on the same token, he's also the brutal God, right? It's opposites. And even early in the book, I kind of skipped over this part, but Jung kind of talked about how the Christian belief made it so every Christian has to live an existence that compels you to exist at the center of opposites. And Jung argues that God, that's the most godly and divine thing on earth, is when the opposites coalesce and touch. So that's pretty much all I have to say about Answer to Job by Carl Jung. I hope you liked the video. If you did like it, definitely check out the book. The book's actually not that long, but I actually did skip a ton of stuff. So if you like this video, definitely check out the book. And yeah, if you like this video, also consider giving me a like and subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks a ton. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.